1 2 2 2. Check 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 check. Hey, yeah, 1 2 2 2. Check, yeah, hey, 1.
Now there's still people coming in. Okay. Well, good morning. I'm Jennifer Stewart, the Director of the School of Public Policy and Administration. Carleton University acknowledges the location of its campus on the traditional, unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. In doing so, Carleton acknowledges it has a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. We are honored that you would observe the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation with us. Today is a day of reflection, a day to reflect on our history, a day to reflect on our future. And it is important that we do this together. We hope today provides you much to think about. I would like to thank my colleagues, Catherine Minich and Jerry Sabin, faculty in the school, for planning today's talk. Mary Giles, our event coordinator, thank you for your usual expertise and organization. This event was made possible through the generosity of a donor, Paul Smith. Paul is a graduate of the School of Public Policy and Administration. He came to the school as a mature student, having worked in government before pursuing his graduate degree. Our faculty describe Paul as an insightful student with a deep appreciation of the dynamic between government, business, and politics. Paul's love of country and dedication to good government would follow him throughout his career, where he continues to serve in an executive capacity as a bridge builder between the public and private sector. On behalf of the school, I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude for his generous support to help us organize an event around the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I now ask Catherine Minich to continue with today.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Ulakut. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you the speakers in today's discussion. My first words, though, I am indebted to the local, historic, and original people who attended to the rivers and valleys around Ottawa, a people known as Algonquin. The second words I offer are to the behind-the-scenes people who worked so hard in bringing this event into production. Our academic director, Jennifer Stewart, thank you. My colleagues Jerry Sabin and my colleague Mary Giles. From the idea to delivery, it's been a rewarding experience working with you. My last words will attend to the discussion that we have the privilege of listening to in a few minutes between Madeleine and Julie. The duo collaborated on what we know is the title of the Qikiqtani Truth Commission. As far as Truth Commissions goes, this one was really specific to a region, the Qikiqtani. It is the Baffin region. And I am sure by the end of this, you'll be thoroughly acquainted to this part of Nunavut. Even though the specifics of the truth was being sought about the dogs and their work that Julie and Madeleine delivered so much more. They give voice to my grandparents, to a different generation, to my ananatsiak and atatatsiak. I will not take much more time. And I want to make sure that you know the connection between the calls to action that September 30th has become as a day of observation. The difficulties of residential schools in particular presented for hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people. For me, this day is close to my family, as it is for many of my Indigenous colleagues, Indigenous students, and that are across campus today. So reconciliation is the driving motivation to share this body of work with you, to better understand and contextualize and value what it is to be in this space. As many of you may have found out in your preview to the Qikiqtani Truth Commission, found on their website, there are community profiles, key findings, and final reports that have not stopped. The commission was in operation for 3 years between 2007 and 2010, but the coverage continues today. So a little bit about our speakers. Madeleine Redfern from Qikiqtani has a great deal of governance and volunteer experience with Indigenous and Inuit organizations. She's a graduate from the Qikiqtani Law School with an LLB from the University of Victoria, and the first Inuk to be given a Supreme Court of Canada clerkship. Inspired award recipient for her contributions to the public service, Madeleine was the executive director of the Qikiqtani Truth Commission, which reviewed the effects of the federal government policies on the Eastern Arctic Inuit between the 1950s and the 1980s. Her advocacy, professional, and governance work has shown her dedication and passion toward the development and the delivery of programs assisting Aboriginal, Indigenous, Inuit, Northerners, and Canadians that reflect community values, needs, and priorities. I think I was even talking to her earlier about being the queen of business in Nunavut. So. And Julie Harris is a public historian and heritage professional based in Ottawa, whose firm Content Works worked on the Qikiqtani Truth Commission from 2008 to 2013. Julie has worked for other Indigenous organizations and communities, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, the Qikiqtani Inuit Association, Treaty 8 Tribal Associations, the Indigenous Heritage Circle, and the First Peoples Cultural Council. She recently co-authored a study for the IHC on UNDRIP. A couple housekeeping notes. There is a small time that we've allotted at the end for some questions. There are pens and paper. If you didn't want to speak, you can come deliver your questions to Jerry or I, and we can do that for you. We also have a microphone on the other side of the room. There's 2 microphones. Mary just pointed that out. So if you could please ask your question into the microphone, that way it'll be picked up on our audio presentation and video presentation. So thank you for that, and welcome to everybody online who's watching. We're happy you're here. Okay. Thank you.
Going back. First thing to learn is how to use the clicker. There we are. So thank you for the introduction, Catherine. That was excellent, and I really appreciate it. You might have noticed there was a discrepancy in dates. So the Qikiqtani Truth Commission lasted from 2007 to 2010, but I continued to work on it after the commission was finished to just finalize and tidy up reports and to deal with some of the information management. So Madeleine and I have been working together off and on, mostly on from 2008 to 2010. We worked very closely together. She started several months before I did to organize the Qikiqtani Truth Commission, and so she's going to be speaking about that, and those are the kinds of topics that she'll be addressing. And we're really hoping that this conversation will give you a chance to learn more about the Truth Commission and to think deeply about how truth-telling fits into what Canada is looking at in terms of both reconciliation and the, I guess, full enjoyment of Indigenous rights that do belong to Indigenous peoples. So, Madeleine, do you want to talk about who we're speaking for?
Well, thank you. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Carleton University for inviting me today. I am speaking as the former executive director of the Qikiqtani Truth Commission, so I'm sharing my personal perspectives. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Qikiqtani Inuit Association that organized the commission, or Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, which was a major funder and contributor. So also, maybe just to sort of go a little bit into, what was the mandate of the commission. QIA, our regional Inuit organization, actually approached me in, I guess, about 2007 and asked if I, wanted to be part of this inquiry, and I said, yes, I would love to. However, I wanted the mandate expanded. Originally, it was going to focus just on the killing of the dogs, or what was often termed as the dog slaughter, and relocations. And I felt that it was really important that the commission actually look at, sort of all the types of government policies or decisions or indecisions that were being made and affecting our people from that period of 1950 to 1975. So that would also look at things like housing, policing, health, economic development. Sort of, I saw that there would be intersectionalities between sort of these issues because government had such a huge influence on our lives. So thankfully, the Qikiqtani Inuit Association agreed. And I can still remember people were going like, what the heck? Like, how are you going to tackle this? And I was like, well, you watch me. But first of all, one of the first tasks that we had to do was actually identify who would be a commissioner or commissioners for the commission. And so I do want to acknowledge and thank Commissioner Jimmy Gliorti, who is an Inuk from Labrador and Nunatsiavut, and who had been a judge for approximately 23 years and had just recently retired prior to the creation of our commission, and we thought, he would be a really good fit. And even though he wasn't from our region, there's quite a lot of, sort of similarities between our Inuit people. And in some ways, actually, having him not come from our region also meant that he could actually be a little bit more familiar, but, not caught up in some of the regional or community, politics that sometimes happens a lot, actually. So I just need to acknowledge and thank him because he was such a joy to work with. He was so professional, and then we also had sort of like a tremendous other team. But to go back to sort of that mandate piece is it was not just a period of transition for Inuit, from 1950 to 1975. It was also a tremendous period of transition for Canada. After World War II, you had the development of universal programs like on healthcare and education, farmers and fishermen and everyone, having to send their children to school, the development of programs like social assistance, old age pensions, and disability payments. So, so we were going to be exploring, this sort of immense mandate, but thankfully, very targeted region. And I know I'm probably going a little bit sort of like off script, but I just wanted to give people a sense of, how the commission at least, was created. So it's probably the only, I think, Indigenous created, Indigenous funded, Indigenous-led Truth Commission in the world. And even then, when we were looking at sort of the work that we were going to do, we actually looked at a whole bunch of commissions around in different countries and what were their mandates and what were their approaches. And the fact that we were Indigenous-led and funded meant that we had a lot more freedom, to sort of do things in a way that we thought would be more culturally appropriate. But also recognizing that we were going to be probably under a significant more, scrutiny or a microscope because there is always this expectation that anything Indigenous, led is somehow going to be inferior, inadequate, or, just torqued. And so we had a really high standard for ourselves about, the kind and quality of work that we were going to undertake. So I think I've kind of at least set the stage a little bit about sort of, how we sort of set ourselves up.
I think so. I think you've done a good job, Madeleine. This is sort of the kind of voice that I heard when she asked me to get involved in this project. And I was taken aback. Like, you're doing what? How quickly? Where? I was amazed at what not only Madeleine, but the Qikiqtani Inuit Association staff, Joanna Siakamalek helped Madeleine with organizing all these meetings, which we're going to talk a bit more about, but it really was an ambitious project that could have failed, and it didn't. It was an incredible success in many ways. So one of the things that made it a success was that you managed to interview, we recorded 342 testimonies. And those people varied, and I don't know what are some of the more memorable testimonies that you remember. So some of them, they were in all 13 communities, which I will get I'm going to skip forward. I have to keep up with Madeleine as usual, so I do a presentation and then, so these are, where the red dots are, those are the 13 communities in the Qikiqtani region. Do you want to describe the region, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of your memories of some of the meetings that you had?
So in Nunavut, which is the new territory that was created on April 1st, 1999 as a result of a Nunavut land claim agreement, is actually split up into 3 regions. And so the Qikiqtani region is the largest by far, with 13 communities. And you can see Sanikiluaq is quite further south in sort of the Hudson Bay and goes all the way up to Grise Fiord. There's approximately 13, it's probably now closer to 15,000 Inuit. And the largest community, which is the capital city, is Iqaluit, which is on South Baffin. And if we go back to the previous slide, which actually I think shows, sort of the broader context. So to get from, Ottawa to Iqaluit or either is about a 3-hour jet plane ride, the same distance as going from Ottawa to Fort Lauderdale, but straight north. So it just gives you sort of a sense, of the scale and the distance. So when we were, sort of like having to consider and organize this commission, there was going to be the archival component of it, which, which Julie will talk more about. And maybe I'll just speak very briefly. I remember sort of calling someone I knew who worked at the Library and Archives Canada and sort of said, okay, tell me, who is working in the private sector with significant archival experience and who is like, great and wonderful and you would recommend. And Julie, was definitely recommended to me, and we've been exceptionally lucky, for the work that she did and the team that she led. But equally, important was being able to organize these community visits. It's really far and it's really expensive, and it's often challenging to schedule these visits into our communities. Kimmeroot, which is very close to us, has 4 flights a week. The community up at Grise Fiord only has 2 flights a week. And to give you an idea of cost, from Iqaluit to Kimmeroot, which is about a 15-20 minute plane ride, is almost, $1,000 per person one way.
And we had all that equipment.
Oh my God, the equipment. Oh, that was a nightmare initially. So yeah, I mean, you can kind of see the setup in the back and a sense of,
I'll show some pictures
yeah,
there.
what's required. And we actually were able to sort of scale back. And so I even had to learn how to put the equipment together, because I then found out that, if I was going to travel, and no disrespect to the technicians here, but it would, I'd have to pay for the technicians to travel, and then I would have to pay for their time there. And since we had about a $3 million budget over 3 years, and I produced, I think, the budget within the first sort of like month and a half of the time since I started, and I was like, I need to cost save. And so I learned how to put all that together. I ended up being the transcriber and typing furiously whenever, we had someone testify. But to prep for, us going into the communities was also a lot of work. So within
It was a bit more than prepping. It was also doing it in a way that was respectful of Inuit protocols. And I think that was obviously something I knew nothing about, and that was a large part of what you had to do. And maybe you can talk about why that was so important.
Well, the Inuit have had a long experience of primarily researchers and anthropologists and government, people coming into our communities to sort of research us or interview us, and so we knew that, being Inuit-led, my apologies for the mic, that we had to do it, respectfully. And so there were 2 components. One was Joanna Qikiqtani, who I hired, was extremely well known in the region, and speaks Inuktitut. and so was able to sort of work with me in organizing, our initial visits into the communities. But also too is that knowing my commissioner was not from this region, I actually asked Julie and her team to produce community summaries in preparation for that. So Julie and her team very quickly, looked at sort of secondary sources, and so anything that was published, to sort of like bring together some facts.
But originally we were looking at doing 2 or 3 pages, but then you discovered that you wanted more than that, and they've ended up being quite long histories, but we couldn't write those in advance. The ones, I wouldn't even want to show the ones that we wrote in advance, because I had not been there, and you hadn't been to all those communities either.
No, not all of them. But and it was interesting because, it gave us a sense of like, who were the major families, where were the camps before they moved into the communities, who were the RCMP officers, their names, was there a Hudson Bay Post, where was it situated, was there a church?
I think the names of the people in the communities were really important for the commissioner to know, because these communities are small. They range from 300 people up to several thousand, but that's the only one that has over 1,000 is, I think now, still is Iqaluit. And so the commissioner, though, knew a lot of people, and we could talk about anecdotes in this whole thing. We could talk about that for 10 hours, but one of the anecdotes that really was one of the experiences I had was traveling with Jim Igloliarte to Igloolik, and on the plane there was Jim and myself, a RCMP officer, 2 RCMP officers, and an accused who was going for a trial in Igloolik. And Jim knew all of them because he'd been a circuit court judge. And so the RCMP and the accused were like, "Oh, we're so happy to have you on this plane." And it was like a party. Like everybody was happy because he knew everyone. But some of the communities, he didn't know people that as well as he did in other communities. I don't think he'd ever been to Grise Fjord. So this idea that relationships, some relationships were existing already, some needed to be built, and some needed to be sustained, and some needed to be repaired.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things also too is that in preparation of our going into the communities was not just the production of the community histories, was I knew how important it was to have a feast, to basically sort of the night before our sort of testimonial days is to, identify hunters or bring our own country food, and usually it was a combination of. And that way, it meant that the community got to meet us, on their terms, and for us to share food. And you can see here, Jim cutting up a seal, and it's raw, and of course, it's part of our traditional diet. It's part of our 100-mile diet, and just we're also talking about communities where sometimes you have really high rates of poverty and food insecurity, and not everyone can go and hunt, and a lot of people desperately want access to traditional food. So it was so good to have that introduction. We would introduce ourselves. There was also quite a bit of work done before we went into the community. Most of the communities have community radios, and so being able to go and speak on the radio about who's coming, what we're doing, and so we had tremendous level of, I think, comfort and buy-in from the community, because it was being done the right way, and we did have the sort of the public testimonial sort of spaces similar to this, but we also made it clear that we would be able to go into people's homes if they were either not comfortable testifying in a public setting, if there were elders that didn't want to leave their home, or persons with disabilities. So everything was in English and in Inuktitut and we were clear from the beginning that the language the official language of the commission would be Inuktitut and English, and that whichever language that someone testified in, so if they testified or shared their history experiences, in Inuktitut, that was the official record. It wasn't going to be English. And we also decided how important it was to be able to record those. So we had the video, we had the audio, we had the translation, and it just made people, really comfortable, because usually in most of these exchanges, it all functions in English, which is not actually people's first language.
So before you started out down the road and you prepared an interview sort of guide, it was an interview guide, and that guide really focused originally on was intended to focus, as you mentioned, on the killing of sled dogs. So I wonder if you want to talk just briefly about how that story feeds into the Qikiqtani Truth Commission. And also, it's, I think, a good point, since this is the day that people are thinking about residential schools, to point out that you didn't really talk about you didn't set out to talk about residential schools or on purpose, and maybe you want to explain why.
We were mindful of the fact that the Government of Canada had created the National Truth and Reconciliation on Residential Schools, and we didn't want to duplicate work and effort.
And pain.
Yeah, well, exactly, and pain, and that that was going to be a separate process. And the other thing too, that, as I said earlier, our communities are often over-consulted or over-engaged, on often the same topic over and over and over again. So we didn't want to do that. We also didn't, for the most part, focus either on the high Arctic relocations that have been done by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal people. So we were, looking at the new issues or undocumented issues, and we also pretty much just said, we'll listen to what you want to tell us, so while there was sort of the interview sort of guide, it was a bit loose, it was like we're here to understand your experiences from this period of how and why you went from living on the land to living in the communities, and any other sort of ancillary issues you wanted to speak about, sort of how the dogs got reduced in numbers. You want to talk about tuberculosis, going down south and what happened, and losing family members. So it was really open. I think the first hearing that we did in Cape Dorset, King 8 was a valuable learning experience. We had to adjust, from that and learn from that. And we definitely improved the engagements from learning from the first one.
The decision, as part of this, I'm really going off script too, just so you guys know. The decision to use an affirmation at the beginning of each interview, which I decided it was too complicated to show the videos here, but almost all the videos are online. I think there are 310 of the testimonies are online, and are sometimes what you're hearing in English will be the translator's voice. I would say about 85% of the time, but the translators were chosen. Usually this translator you chose arrived too, and not because they had family responsibilities. But what I was going to say and ask about was this decision to have the people testifying affirm. I thought was interesting. And why did you end up deciding to do that, even though it was, quote, informal?
Well, it was important, also for legitimacy purposes, that. And
I want to explain. So, explaining affirming means that when the 342 people who testified to the Qikiqtani Truth Commission about a range of experiences and a range of ideas, before they started to speak, they were asked, as you would in court, to affirm that they were speaking the truth.
And we learned quickly, and I always felt that, you know, and my own experience is that most people only share what they personally know, you know, what they personally experienced. So it, as I said with Commissioner Igliorti, it was just a very natural and humble way of sort of like asking people, you know, that when they came before him to share their experiences, that they were effectively saying, this is, you know, what, this is my truth. This is what happened to me. And maybe I just want to, you know, also say that what was fascinating about that is a lot of people who shared, you know, their experiences had sometimes not shared this with even their spouses or their children. You know, like the most traumatic experiences, you know, how and why, you know, a hunter had lost his dogs. You know, either, you know, when Inuit had moved into the settlements, effectively dogs, you know, weren't supposed to be loose, or you just had an official that, you know, for whatever reason, took it upon that, you know, I'm just going to effectively kill or exterminate, you know, this hunter's dogs. And I remember in Clyde River, you know, a man testifying, and he was older, he was an elder, and, you know, saying, you know, how he'd gone to feed his dogs one day, and the area administrator had basically come and without real explanation, you know, shot all his dogs. And what's important to understand is that dogs were really integral to our people's way of life. It was our transportation. It was our way for our hunters to go out and procure food, and, you know, and so the dependency on dogs would be, I don't want to even say it's like compare it to a car, because it's not. It's way more, you know, significant. But it's part of our culture. It's part of our identity. It's, you know, it's you know, it's effectively your livelihood. And so, you know, he's there, you know, explaining this happened to him, and crying, and, you know, I think all of us were in tears, and I'm typing away just listening to it, and it was so hard and impactful. And I'm going to cry. His wife was in the audience, as were his children. And she decides she wants to come up and testify. And she says she never knew what happened to the dogs, and he never told her, you know, and but their way of life changed that day, irreparably. And she said he started to drink, you know, like soon after, but hadn't made that correlation. And as part of that, you know, that drinking also came the violence, and which, you know, they had, you know, sort of been now part of their lives. And she's, you know, saying, I never knew, I'm so sorry, you know, you never told me. And the children, who were adults, were in the audience. And she then turns to her children and says, I'm so sorry that I drank and I hurt you. Because that violence had actually gone from sort of the killing of the dogs onto the man, onto the spouse, and onto the children. And none of them had shared that. And so it was, you know, it was incredibly painful, but, you know, a single act, you know, had these ripples. And she's there crying and asking for her children to forgive her, as she forgave her husband. So that's just, you know, one story, and there were so many, you know, and where, you know, even after a lot of times, you know, at the end of the day or even the next day, we had individuals come to the commissioner and to our team and say thank you, you know, just telling, you know, what had happened. You know, whether it was a story about tuberculosis.
In all its, and it was also telling that story in all its complexity, not trying to compartmentalize it into one thing that I think hearing people speak about how the moving into communities, the way in which housing was allocated or not allocated, the way that if you were, I mean, I think one of the things that struck me was if you were a very, very good hunter in the 1950s and 60s, the government actually tried to get you not to move into town. And so the first people who got the housing were the people who weren't as good hunters. And so your talents actually worked against you, which I think is something that I never thought about at all. Another way that we'll talk about, I guess, about the vulnerability issue. So that, yeah, the most successful families often ended up with the most difficult situations. I think that's something that it can be explored in every part of Indigenous history in Canada. Success worked against you often. So I want to go to, I'll just, hopefully, yeah, we're here. This is one of the testimonies. Madeleine picked out a couple of quotes. So with this one, the topic of housing was raised repeatedly in the testimonies. Even, I'd say, as much as the dogs, because a lot of people didn't experience the killing of the dogs firsthand. So they would say to the commissioner, if you asked a question, sorry, I don't know about that. I just heard stories, but I do know about this, and I want to talk about this. Thing that came up over and over again was the unfairness and the cost of housing. And we could talk about that for a long time and talk about it historically, but in thinking about what you heard then, and you've been interested in housing for so long and you're involved in so much in housing issues, are there things from the Qikiqtani Truth Commission that have informed the way that you approach housing for Inuit today?
Well, maybe I'll just go back a little bit to, your initial sort of question, comment on housing. So, part of relocations or the centralization and the move of Inuit from a nomadic way of life into the settlements, ended up being all pretty much a big housing question or a big housing issue. So what we learned is that, there were different sort of ways in which Inuit moved into the communities. So there were the ones that were, chose of their own free will, voluntarily moved into the communities. And, sometimes it was just initially tents. But when the government started a kind of a centralized program, because it was hard to deliver these, education and health care and old age benefits and child care benefits, if people kept moving around, and so there was a bit of a centralization policy. But at the same time, as Julie said, there was also equally a policy by some to sort of like that wanted Inuit to remain on the land because that was cheap and that was easier. So you had this government schizophrenic approach, depending on not only different departments have different, agendas or priorities, but also the individuals within those different departments had different, perspectives and beliefs. And some, wanted Inuit to just remain untouched, and, because that meant they kept them pure. As I said, sometimes they said that.
They use that word.
Yeah, pure and the real Inuit and not to contaminate them. And other times they said that, and actually sort of cheapness was actually the real rationale. And then you had others that wanted, to assimilate or integrate, Inuit into sort of the modern society. So you had this sort of like, push and pull dynamics even happening, at the same time. So you had some that moved sort of more voluntarily. You had some that were enticed to move into the communities. You'll get housing. It'll be free housing. Then you had those that were sort of like pressured or coerced. You got to move into the communities
For schooling.
Primarily for schooling. And then you had eventually those, mostly the successful hunters that really resisted moving into the communities because, they liked their independence and they were self-sufficient and they liked their way of life. They
And
didn't.
the Hudson's Bay Company liked them.
Yeah, and so didn't really want sort of, to move into the settlements. And then we've got some horror stories about, some of those forced relocations and where, some of those hunters one day in one of the outpost camps or, their traditional camp were sort of out hunting, and then the administrators in the nearby community sort of took advantage of that and went and took, got a plane and brought the women and children into the settlement. And thankfully, one of the women who testified, or the family, had left a note for her husband. There was high literacy rates amongst Inuit.
From the Anglican Church.
From the missionaries, and Wood left a syllabic written note saying, like, we've been taken in. And could you just imagine, you coming home, a number of, like, hunters, let's say that's about 5-6 families, and so that represented, 6+ spouses and probably 25 children, and you come and they're gone. Just gone. Like, thankfully one, as I said, left a note. And then sort of like they were brought into the center, and there was never enough housing. I can promise you that the government didn't properly plan or understand, how to, bring people into the settlement. So some...
Don't you think that's continuing today?
Absolutely continuing today. So you had those that got the first houses, great. And then you got those that, sort of brought in their tents, and then you had those that made, houses out of whatever they could find in the dump. And we've literally, the lack of housing was, happened right at the beginning. And it set up, sort of this disparity and poverty in our communities.
The concept of poverty, too,
A different kind of poverty.
Thing. It was a different kind of poverty, and I think that's something I really learned from working with you and doing all this listening to people, was that they didn't feel poor until the government told them they were poor. They had what they needed, and then the government said, well, you're not asking for enough, really. You should be asking for schools. You should be, and they would write it down. They would say, essentially we need Inuit to become consumers. We need them to buy either directly or through us. We need them to start acquiring goods from southern Canada.
And be like,
yeah,
Canadians.
But not too much.
No.
They could have a car, but not one with fins.
Oh.
So it was, or a snowmobile, I should say, and not one that was very fancy. So I think the housing, that was one of the things that really was an important part. The other thing was, this quote is really from one of the times that you went back into the communities. So what Madeleine hadn't really talked about yet was the fact that we did there was the collection of the 342 testimonies in 13 communities, Ottawa, and also in some other places in Canada. There was all the archival research involving 30-some thousand documents that were researched, collected, and scanned, which I'll show you in a minute. But then the commissioner and Madeleine came to Ottawa and organized an event with Inuit, most QIA Inuit, to talk about the recommendations. They then went and you actually developed the recommendations, and then she went back. Madeleine went back, and sometimes Jim went back, and sometimes I went back to all 13 communities to talk about the recommendations.
A bit more than that. So,
okay,
I mean, no,
more?
so, no, because the reason why we pitched, the need to go back to the communities was not just the recommendations. It was also to go back and validate what did we hear
Right.
from, the communities. Because not everyone had attended every sort of, testimonial sort of that had been given in that community. We'd also learned a lot from their archival research. And things that, Inuit knew what they knew, but often like they weren't told why. So they didn't necessarily understand the motivations, or sometimes it turned out the motivations were a bit different.
Because the question that they often asked was, they didn't believe, most people said, not everybody obviously, the government didn't set out to hurt us. Like they didn't set out to make our lives horrible. How come they made our lives horrible? Our lives were horrible. Why? Nobody designed them to be horrible. So then we looked in the archival record and we could start to see, and they could explain it, and the leaders could explain it.
Yeah, so it was interesting. So, we were able to go back and say, this is what we heard from your community. This is what we heard from the other communities, because sometimes they would be, very similar. Other times, things could be very distinct. Like there was a horrendous sort of issue in Hall Beach where I guess the area administrator had wanted to sort of like actually, develop some housing where they had created a kind of an ad hoc cemetery, and the way that often it would work is that when officials would ask you, to do something and they didn't want to do it, they wouldn't say no. They just, nod their head and not do it. Until one day the hunters had gone and the administrators, spoke to some teenagers and asked them to basically, dig and take the bodies and move them. And, can you imagine, like, you as 15, 16, 17, sort of like actually going and digging, and the bodies were semi-decomposed, and having to remove, bodies that were coming apart, and they were scarred, absolutely scarred. I mean, these were the individuals as teenagers, young men were scarred, their parents were scarred, their siblings were scarred. Like, I mean, it was just done so badly. It was just wrong. But the point was to, sort of like say, this is what we heard. And we'd gone through that exercise, of as a team, and sort of trying to figure out, from what we learned, is develop some draft recommendations and bring those back to the communities and say, this is what we heard, and here are some ideas of what, some of the recommendations could be, and also be able to develop recommendations that were maybe specific to that community, because that community had experienced, something like that, moving of those graves that no other community had. And so it was really important, and I have to acknowledge and thank the Qikiqtani Inuit Association for giving us, permission and the budget to be able to do that, because it was, too often what happens is we get people who, come into our communities, interview our people, do this external research of the archives and write a report, and ta-da, it's done. No, we had to bring that history back and validate it, share it, provide answers. Especially.
Yeah, there were specific questions about why officials did certain things, or why the RCMP did certain things. And we tried to find the answers, didn't always find them exactly, but you could explain them. But I think also this issue of vulnerabilities is really interesting. So and that was something that came up in many of the interviews, was we did it because we felt like we had no choice. We did things that we didn't think were right for us because we had no choice. But it is a colonial trope that there's a continuous exploitation of vulnerabilities in the past. We know that. And I'm wondering if you think some of those vulnerabilities are still being exploited today.
Oh, absolutely.
As a way to get Inuit or other Indigenous people to acquiesce to certain things. Well,
I think, what I learned from the process of this commission is, how and why the dynamics exist in our communities. Sort of the history between sort of Inuit and non-Inuit, Inuit and government, even, the dynamics that exist between Inuit and Inuit. Mm-hmm. So what was interesting is, I remember in Glulik where several people testified, and we'd heard it in other places as well, but saying, one of the things that we have a really hard time was like learning to live with strangers. And there was at that point in time often just like one white RCMP officer, one white Anglican or, Catholic church minister, and one, RCMP officer. These were all single white men. And what they were referring to was actually living with other Inuit. Like, we had been nomadic sort of familial tribes and groups. And just, it was challenging to now live, amongst these larger groups of, people that you were unrelated to, and with all these sort of external pressures, not enough housing, whether your children, were forced to go to school in that community or flown out. Like what we also learned is that virtually nothing about almost anyone's life was of their decision. It was going to be an area administrator or government that, decided whether you got housing, every aspect. I remember asking Joanna Siakumelik, my assistant, at one point, when he just off the cuff shared with me, it wasn't testimony, about how he'd gone to training in Red River. And I was like, and he's from Arctic Bay, and I'm like, Red River, and looking at the map of Canada, going, why the hell did you go to Red River? He goes, as if I knew and had a choice. And it was just like, it was one of those sort of epiphanies that virtually no one had, that much freedom or choice, as to where they lived, whether they got a house or not, whether they got a job or not. So much of our people's lives were not only under surveillance, that's another sort of like thing that I haven't talked about, and just that there was no freedom. And that, as Julie said earlier, our people had been self-sufficient and independent and acknowledged that they'd gone through periods of hardship. Weather, sometimes would make it harder to hunt. Yes, sometimes you lost hunters or wives to, or spouses, to disease, just things happen. But they said that, those were external forces that were sort of beyond control. It was part of life. But this, sort of colonial imposition, which basically sort of like took, all your freedoms away, was that much harder, and supposedly on the basis that we needed saving. And that, tuberculosis rates went through the roof, with the new housing rather than sort of, our traditional housing. There was so much rampant sort of negative impacts and harms that were created by sort of new government policies, and sometimes we could see that the original purpose or basis was to improve our lives, but there was so much like disconnection by people that were coming up from the south that just didn't know the geography, that didn't know the place, the people, the culture, and rarely ever asked us, what do you want to do? Where do you want to live? Like, and settlements were created often around an existing HBC post, Hudson Bay Post, or an RCMP post, or an Anglican church. And I can tell you, we're now living the effects, because often these communities are not good for, water,
Well,
or transportation or hunting, or they're just not often exactly where they ideally should be for a settlement, a permanent community to be situated.
Yeah, I think that the history of those, when we did the local histories, the histories of each of the communities in the region, that was something that really struck me as well, was how different each of their histories was. So Iqaluit, for example, is an American military base before it's anything else. It was not a good place. There wasn't a lot of biomass in Iqaluit. You couldn't really, nobody lived there. It wasn't a permanent area for camps. It's further south. And then other places really were very rich, like Iqaluit, which had been, it's been occupied for thousands of years, continuously.
But now has a water issue because of the size of the community.
And that story of Iqaluit's interesting because the community was split in half between the Anglicans and the Catholics. might have been Belfast, you know, like it was very, and it was purposeful, like it was a way of bringing religion to the masses, I guess.
So maybe I just, add is that what we definitely learned is, these power dynamics, that were influencing, as I said earlier, different government departments, different individuals, and some, I have to acknowledge that there were definitely some officials that were way more respectful, way more sort of recognizing that, as an RCMP officer, this law, of Canada doesn't really fit very well here, so I'm just going to turn a blind eye.
The RCMP officer who was very, very concerned about the treatment of women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And wrote about it and was reprimanded for being, I think, too sensitive. And ultimately we found out, that
and maybe I want to share was, just the Pangertung experience about sort of like the ship coming in for the tuberculosis. Because what I really, think that's value about this is that we heard of a single event from multiple perspectives. And so we had an area administrator who had come up and was just sort of trying to figure out, okay, what's happening? People are being put on the ship, they're being tested, some stay on, some get off, and realizing after a while, like, does anyone know where they're going? And the people who are, the family members behind, do they know where their loved ones are going, and finding out that they didn't? And this really distressed him, and so he started sort of an initiation of campaign of like, okay, well, like people should, somehow remain connected and facilitated, both sort of identification of location, letter writing, and being able to, know where your loved one is. We also heard from a woman who had, in Pangertung, had gotten, on the ship, and she had an amouti and with her baby in the back, and I guess the technician had seen a shadow on her lungs, and so the baby got taken out of the amouti, and just given to someone who was getting off the ship. Her husband, and other children were on the shore, and she's not allowed off the ship, to see goodbye to her husband and make sure her baby goes to, like, her family, because, just, no, you can't. And just being that distress, and again, not knowing where she's going or for how long. And then hearing from, we at a similar event like this in Ottawa with Indian and Northern Affairs sort of event, and sharing this story. Susan Salmon, had shared with us afterwards. She said, I was a little white girl. My parents were up in Pangertung. I think they were sort of part of, the government.
Or the hospital.
Yeah, and she's like, I couldn't understand why. All the women were on their knees, crying and singing, because they were losing their loved ones. So we got the testimony from, the spouses that were like, my wife's gone, who's going to look after my children? Or if it was a husband, who's going to provide for us? And then hearing about, other family members that said, yeah, it's being stuck in the, the bottom of a ship that sort of goes through the region for, weeks, and then being sent south. And if you can watch a movie called The Necessities of Life, I highly recommend it. It's one very unique, tuberculosis story. But, children, running around, because that's what children do, and the nurses getting angry at them, and so tying them down to their beds for hours, every day, just because it was like, and then hearing about sort of, that one little girl who was originally from Cape Dorset, sort of, they messed up, and so she got sent to Sanikiluaq, if you go back to the map. which is really far south from where Qikiqtani is. And so she ends up, the ships came once a year. So she's like, down in Santa Kilowak. And then we heard, literally she was taken to like 5 different communities 5 years in a row. Never the right community until finally she gets back to Qikiqtani. 5 years later, she was like originally like 7 when they, were trying to bring her back. And they arrive at Qikiqtani, and her parents, of course, didn't know where she was or when she was coming back. And thankfully, there happened to be another family member, family group there that knew her family and took her home.
But there's so many stories of things that
but
happen.
before you go there, is that, so what we were able to do is with the archival records and all these different testimonies from, from area administrators, RCMP officers, the records, we were able to validate almost everything that, Inuit told the commissioner. There and in the previous RCMP, report on sled dogs, the RCMP had said Inuit lied. Inuit elders lying, that they just want money.
We could validate, but we weren't seeking to, quote, validate. We could explain. We could say, yes, that must have happened. Not that many of those experiences were detailed, recorded. Like history, the public record doesn't work that way, especially when it's an official record. And that's something that I had to deal with, was the fact that this is an official record. And so not the entire truth is in it. It's sort of the highlights of what people in Ottawa wanted to hear. And then the other thing, though, was that it helped, the archival record helped to explain it. But this whole issue of people not knowing why something was happening, that was a part of what you asked that the Qikiqtani Truth Commission do, was help explain why these things happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was really important in the kind of work that you set out to do. It wasn't just to put out a whole bunch of facts. It was to really try to understand why. And especially, as you said, going back to those communities was brilliant, because people had asked questions during their testimonies. Like, why did they do this? They would just look at the commissioner and they'd look at Madeleine and say, why? Why would someone do this? Well, there's a lot of ignorance and thinking that government officials thinking that they were, I don't know, that they should be in control. I don't think it was, we banned the expression best intentions.
Yep. Yeah, the fact is that we were often saw or told that, it had to been for best intentions. And at the end of the day, when you looked at it, it was
ranked intentions.
Yeah, and the other, I do have to give, some of the folks that were sent up north, as some of them some leeway, because, they just didn't know where they were going, and so RCMP officers in their young, 20s being given what's the training about horses? I can't think of the word. Equestrian training, and there's no horses, it's dogs. And literally Inuit kept saving the lives of almost every RCMP officer who came up because they were just not adequately prepared, and literally, so they didn't starve. But, and even sort of on the housing, they just, they weren't adequately resourced. The government, their bosses down in Ottawa, completely disconnected. And, at the end of the day, it was a bit of a shit show.
Well, yeah, and also a lot of the bureaucrats were trying, and I guess especially for talking in this context, a lot of the bureaucrats were getting a feather in their cap by experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
So if you went to the north, you would write back and say, well, we've decided to change this program a bit. We're going to experiment with this. Well, then they're wondering why Inuit, we couldn't explain why Inuit were so frustrated with the housing program, because it changed. I couldn't keep track. Literally, I had every document I have tons of documents to work with. I'll just show you what we have to bring the history in here somewhere, all the research. But we'd have documents, and this one, I don't know which one this is, but I can't even read it from here. That's terrible.
Letter to Commissioner, RCMP from H.A.
Oh,
Larson.
this is one of the more famous documents. It's
Yeah.
about the high Arctic relocations, which in theory we weren't looking at, but we had to really understand them. But my point is we'd have hundreds of documents about the housing program in particular, and the program changed so often that even looking back on it and having all these pieces of paper in front of you, you could not track what the rules were on any day. So when we heard in those testimonies, people would say, but we were promised this. I could tell you, yeah, you were that day, but the next day you weren't.
But also
And it was experimentation, and bureaucrats did get promotions based on the fact that they had developed a new program. The government didn't seem to take into account that the next year another person developed a new program to replace the one.
yes.
It was very weird.
Well, no, and that we still suffer that, today. And so maybe where I want to go is that, I thought I'd known this history pretty well because I had read a lot. I'm one of those people that goes down rabbit holes and just like, prolific, and I want to understand stuff. And so I thought I knew this history well going before into the commission, and it turned out I knew virtually none of it. And because, people who had written about it were non-Inuit. We spoke to a lot of them who had written that record, and at the end of the day, they just said, "Well, we didn't have your resources, And so what they had written, had turned out to be quite superficial and sometimes, accurate in some ways, but a lot it just was never, the fulsome analysis. They often looked at one topic, and so it turned out like RCMP didn't know their history. Indian Northern Affairs didn't know their history. The Department of Health didn't know their history. Inuit knew what happened to them, but didn't understand the context and, this forever changing. And what shocked me is that how much of the same sort of like attitudes and approaches are happening today. And this was, back in 2010, but I can say in 2022, it's still quite prevalent. Is that the same sort of like schizophrenic government approaches, exist, different priorities. Every government or, bureaucrat wants to make their mark, high transient, way of people coming up north that, don't know what they don't know, but they think they know better. And, some are romantic, some are very sort of mercenary and self-interested. I actually kind of almost respect the mercenaries better because it's just like it's honest and, you're not trying to save me. And so, economic development, resource development, mining's the way, security, national sovereignty, all that kind of, all the same, pressures are in play today, and we're still making the same mistakes. It just, yesterday I testified before one of the Senate committees on Bill C-5, I think, and, sort of around the changes to mandatory minimum sentences. And there I am sort of explaining to the Senate that, like we weren't consulted, we have a very different culture, very different context, and just explaining that even the notion of discretion, and I'm kind of like trying to be a bit pro-discretion in the sense of, against the mandatory minimum so that the judge, can look at, more appropriate sentencing, but at the same time, trying to explain that the discretion of the police officers, the discretion of the Crown's office, the discretion of the judge is, still causing a lot of like harms, because they're not moving things to restorative justice. They don't trust our communities. So that's how we end up with, 11-year-old who stole a chocolate bar going through the court system, and for years, and not being, resolved in a single matter. So it just, the reason why history matters is to know, what happened, and the fact, if you read the commission report, is that it does try to bring some balance, and that it's not, just the Inuit perspective. It's also trying to understand, the Canadian perspective, the bureaucrats, because it's a shared history. It's a shared reality. It helps explain, how and why the community and the regional dynamics are, and that, unfortunately, nowhere near as much has changed as it should have. Like, we haven't learned from, this history, and we still, need to learn how to live together. I mean, this is, I think, where I'm kind of getting to this reconciliation, is that we have to reconcile what happened, in our past, our shared past. We have to reconcile that, harms were done, and that, whether the intentions were, best interest or not, or mostly not, because that's not, but just how policy gets developed. And that, for the most part, it's just, you can't do it, in Ottawa. And I live from Iqaluit, and I'm a former politician there, and you can't do it from Iqaluit either. And how important it is to really, understand the history and how policy needs to be redeveloped, reassessed, and evaluated, and that people, who the policy is really going to impact need to be part of that process. And rarely are they, and worse yet is when we do policy evaluation, it tends to happen at the, by those who are supposed to implement it, and never asking or seeking the opinions of the people who actually have to, live the effects of that policy. And this thing about, we've got to, the RCMP headquarters, in Iqaluit looks beautiful, big,
Nice sculpture.
Nice. Well, then I don't know about that, but big foyer, and you speak to the RCMP officers, and they're like, it was built 50% too small. We don't have enough holding cells. We don't have enough office space. I go to the Rankin Inlet Trade Center. It's and again, built 50% too small. People can do, some of their courses, whether it's plumbing or oil boiler mechanic, and they can only do sort of 2 years, and then if they want to complete it, they've got to go south for, year 3 and 4. And I'm like, well, you've got the instructors here. Like, why can't they stay in their home territory? Why can't they, why do we have to go south? And they said, because they built it too small. It's just... Oh, so we've got, again, the acting dean is like, we've got all this great sort of 40, 50-foot ceilings in the hallway, which, oh my God, if I could only have a second level so I could have actually space, so I could have my students be able to stay in their home region and their home communities and complete their studies. And then to find out that even 85% of the graduates who successfully complete the course, only 1 out of 10 are given a job, despite the fact that we've got billions of dollars of construction and projects being built in our territory. So it's, even, I'm like, you invest in us, but then the number of times I see programs that are not set up for our people to succeed, and when we do succeed, and that we're still not given, the space and the place in our communities to actually thrive. It just, at the end of the day, maybe one thing that someone recently told me is just like, we've got to stop, squandering all this, investments and creating effectively sort of ghettos in Canadian Arctic, where, up to 80% of our people are living in poverty and food insecure. Just process this. 8 out of 10 Nunavut Inuit preschool children are food insecure.
And that's
today.
That's today. And it wasn't, that is today. I think we need to think now, I'm going to not go through all my slides because I think we've moved on, discussed most of these things. And I think the important part of this one is how I've pulled out a quote, which is saying, acknowledge first, apology maybe. And eventually, in 2016, there was an apology and some funding provided, but there's still a lot left to do. for the full impact of the Qikiqtani Truth Commission to be felt in Nunavut and in the Qikiqtani region. So I think we do have time. If anybody has any questions, we still have some time here today to talk. And we have about 15 minutes left, so just so you know. Some of these slides that I've got on here are just slides from the Qikiqtani Truth Commission.
We went to the schools.
Yeah,
We felt it was incredibly important, you know, for us to go into the schools and let them know the work that we're doing, and the kids loved it.
So I think, yeah, so do you want to move to the questions, Catherine?
Yes, we do. I didn't get any paper questions, but we did want to open it up to the floor now if there are any questions from our participants here. Hi.
Yay.
Are you stretching? Oh, you're coming over. Thank you. Oh, great.
Hello, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I have probably a very elemental question. I know that you said that after the reports were completed, you went back to the communities and talked about the reports and what was the findings and what were the recommendations. I'm wondering if there was any dialogue about the recommendations, or if there's any dialogue ongoing now about how the recommendations are can still be used.
So we had sort of I would say not the completed reports done when we went back to the communities, and the communities really appreciated us sharing the draft recommendations, and because that just never happens. And sort of like, you know, and so the apology one was interesting because we had not, you know, predetermined whether, you know, one of the recommendations was going to be about compensation. And what we heard from elders in particular was that, you know, what they wanted more than anything was an acknowledgement of what had happened, you know, that this really happened to our people. There was also, interestingly enough, some concerns about sort of monetary compensation by some of our people, because, you know, some of the, you know, past abuses, you know, teachers who had sexually abused children. There was that Ed Horn, you know, settlements. And some of the elders community had said, you know, look, we're really worried about sort of, you know, just large cash compensation being given because they had seen some people's lives get really, really hurt by it. I remember one wife who actually came to the second one said, you know, my husband, who she loved a lot, and the father of her children, but they had separated because when he had gotten his compensation, you know, had literally, the way that he had sort of processed it was that, you know, I've now been paid for the sexual abuse that I suffered as a child. And he couldn't, and so he started drinking, and he lost his job. They lost their housing, and they had split up. And so, you know, a lot of the community, there was going to be cost to implementing the recommendations, you know, if done properly. But everyone really, you know, just was like, we want, you know, acknowledgement, and we want to heal, and we want to learn how to, like, you know, they weren't asking for RCMP officers to not be in their communities. They said, we want you to be in our communities, but we want you to be, you know, much more respectful. We need you to be part of our community, but not us and them.
And the second part was about whether or not there's this project is ongoing. It is ongoing. There was funding provided to a certain extent by the federal government as part of the apology, but it's still in negotiations about what that would mean, and it's not individual. It's for the Qikiqtani Inuit Association to address the recommendations, some of which are really quite complicated. They have a lot of partnerships going.
But also some of it is just like trying to say to the government, you need to do things differently.
And a lot of it is that.
Yeah.
And there's various levels of Inuit governance that are dealing with that at the national, at the Canada-wide level, at the Nunavut level and at the regional level.
Yeah.
Is there another question?
And maybe before someone just jumps up, is that I just want to remind people that we only had to produce one report. That's all we were mandated to do. And we produced not only the one
25.
report,
25.
we produce, sub-reports, special studies, the community histories, and then we sort of have the monster sort of archival record, and then we have the public record, public sort of accessible archives, because I was intent on trying to get clearances of almost everything so that all this history, like the raw data, not just the testimonies, but the written records were available to our people, because, it's just outrageous to expect us to all individually have to fly down, and I don't know how to access a single record in our Library and Archives Canada. It's a process. So that was part of the legacy, is recognizing, this body of work that we did, and that we're workaholics. Go ahead.
So many of the students in the room today are planning to work for the federal public service or in government. So I'm wondering what your work and the work of the Truth Commission might say to them about how they should be approaching their careers or thinking about the work they might do with government.
Do you want to tackle that first, or me?
No, I think I'll let you tackle it.
Okay.
As a former civil servant.
Okay. Well, and as also sort of a politician, and
No, I meant I'm a former
yeah, no,
civil servant.
but I think it's really important to realize that you can't and shouldn't do your work in a bubble.
Yeah.
And that lived experiences, of, as I said, people who, the policy is going to be, impact can and should be part of the process. Whether it's around sort of housing or, social services or legislation, like, that's partly why, and we've got this now sort of body of law at the Supreme Court of Canada that requires meaningful consultation. That's why there's a consultations, section in the Nunavut Land Claim Agreement. We're not there yet at doing consultation well, unfortunately, but I think the thing is just don't be scared of like the people that, who you would engage with, whether they're homeless or, if, students or whatever, disabled people, elderly, don't be scared of like, engaging, because more often than not, it's just like, we're looking at, this policy review or developing a new policy, what do you think? Like, you get a tremendous amount of like, information and value of what works, what doesn't work, and additional information that you just wouldn't get from learning from school or from, your learned, friends in the bureaucracy who have worked possibly too much in a bubble. So that's my biggest recommendation, is just be open to that process, and it's nowhere near as scary as you think it is.
I think there's a lot of willingness, perhaps almost too much willingness when I've been in the north, and to think that you're listening. They really, when people talk to you, when Inuit talk to you, they really think you're listening and absorbing. And so if you don't think that you are fully understanding, keep asking the questions, because there's a lot that is behind the words that people say to you. And I've learned that through all my work with Madeleine, that often when I'm sitting and talking to someone, that what they think I'm understanding it at a level that I can't, because I'm not living in their experience and I don't necessarily know the environment. And when they mention someone's name, I don't know who that person is. And then I discover later that that person is somebody who has been fighting for Inuit rights for decades, John Amagalik. So I think you've got to really be humble and ask questions back. And people are not ever upset that you're asking questions. that's not the problem. It's not asking enough questions, I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, good. Another question. We came here because we wanted to hear your questions.
So, just to follow up on Dr. Sabin's point there, I think, sorry, this is half a comment and half a question. I want you to be able to elaborate on this as a former civil servant. I think right now, at least in the public service, it feels like the institution itself, CERNAC, some of the departments, the way that the institution is designed is going the opposite direction of what the Indigenous community actually needs. And so, to elaborate on that point, I think, at least my personal experience right now, is that it feels like public servants are punished for being specialized. How we deal with, or how we promote up the chain, is we jump from department to department. And so I think I was told that the average turnover rate at CERNAC is about a year. So, you develop a relationship with these communities, and then you take the corporate knowledge with you. And so, and same with program evaluations, right? As you mentioned, a lot of these programs are designed not to actually benefit the communities that it was designed for, but it was designed so that you have something presentable to your director, so that you can move up your chain of command, or you can, at the end of the year when you get your evaluation, you yourself look good, and you can continue moving up, and then you take that promotion and you go elsewhere with it, and you continue this vicious cycle over and over. And so, as someone that was in the public service before, do you think this problem has worsened, or do you think, and because also, I think what's fascinating right now is that your presentation has been amazing, but it shows some of the issues that were caused by the past, and we haven't gone to that point where our current modern day institutional problems are being shown explicitly, right? This is something that will come up 10, 15 years, in the future.
So absolutely, it's a huge problem, and it's not just transients that are coming into the north. There's just so much transiency happening, within government, and so often, RCMP, CEO, commanding officer, deputy ministers of different departments, and it's very fatiguing to sort of constantly be trying to inform someone, about the place and what's happened before, because it usually takes about 2 years for someone to really understand, how Nunavut works, and then you lose them. I would say that used to have sort of career bureaucrats that would sort of if they stayed in the Department of Agriculture, would work their way up through that department, or in parks, and you're absolutely right. This lateral moving is absolutely happening a lot. So it means that you don't ever get someone who really understands the file or the issues that they can and should. I mean, I have to say that one of the most sort of thankful experiences I had is I was looking at a hunting case of narwhals, and how and why sort of the communities of in the Kitikmeot of Joe Haven, Toloyuak, and we're getting 15 whale quotas per year, when the evidence didn't seem to support such a low quota number. And calling the Department of Fisheries whale guy in Winnipeg, because that's where, of course, the whale guy should be, is in a landlocked, place. But and he'd been in his job for 25 years, and he knew the history. He remembered that consultation, and and he's like, no, you're absolutely right. We had no evidence as to what the whale population was, or what was a sustainable harvest. We asked the communities, and no one knew, so that's how and why 15 got chosen decades ago. And I was like, well, could we harvest more whales? And he's like, absolutely, because now we have better data, but it was fixed in the legislation. So it's a huge problem. These are legacy problems that, decisions that were made decades ago, and no one remembers the history.
No, nobody remembers the history, but it's so systemic.
Oh, but no one remembers the history from last year.
I know, but it's this issue of changing within the civil service, change people, position. It's not just that the individuals change; the positions actually disappear. So you can't find them. I think it's just, once again, it's this issue of vulnerability. It may not affect people in certain parts of the country or in certain socioeconomic classes that it's more difficult to get hold and figure out who you should be talking to and who's going to influence change if you've got other means to do that. But if you're really vulnerable to those changes, if those changes in the way that a program is administered change, and it's going to affect your health and your security and your
So maybe I'll give you a real one.
condition,
I'll give you a real
makes a
one.
big difference.
So the federal government has moved a lot to online,
Oh, I know.
processes, so, I mean, I was just talking to someone earlier about, like, oh, well, we pay online, you gotta like create, go through the portal. I'm still working on, trying to get reimbursed for expenses because of the Government of Canada's sort of portal. I have crappy internet. Okay, like, I mean, there are days where I can't get an email, I can't do online banking, I can't send a tweet, read a tweet, because, so everything is moving online, and we're like going, hold on, like, we can't. During COVID, when everything moved online and Service Canada office closed, and I'm like desperately, contacting someone who I knew in my own community, who was in Ilka, and said, look, I can't access this website. I need to print off this document. Can I, and I go into your offices and it's closed and the computers are closed and the library computers are closed. And I'm relatively, capable. I can afford sort of, my $500 to $1,000 internet bill a month, process that. And that's not including cable, and that's not including my cell phone. And, so I'm much more privileged than a lot of, other people in my community. And I get incredibly frustrated. So a simple decision of like, doing a CMHC online application for my client who's like a shelter, and, and I'm counting to the minutes because it's like, it's 11:50 and I'm desperately, been for hours uploading, their application. So, before midnight. And it finally like gets in at about like 11:58, 11:59, and I sort of contact the woman the next day, the CMHC rep, who lives in Yellowknife, and I'm just like, oh my God, like, this is not acceptable. Like, if I had not gotten in, my client, who was trying to get a shelter application in, would have not got funding. And, and then I find out months later, she uses that as a success story. The former mayor, she got in the application 11:59, haha. And I was like, that's not funny. And that is not a success story. Yeah. So.
Well, we do think it's been such a success having you here today.
My ranting.
Yay.
Yay.
Thank you.
So on behalf of the School of Public Policy and Administration, thank you so much for taking your time to join us today. I think collectively we're just so pleased to have this conversation and to listen to the two of you talk. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you to you.
I think that's a wrap.
Good.